Hey everyone, I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about Daisy Miller, the reading for our first 2 weeks of the semester. Daisy Miller by Henry James was published first in magazine form over a period of a few months from June to July, actually just 2 months, June to July of 1878. Um, Chronologically, it doesn't, it actually comes after some of the stuff we'll be reading in weeks 3 and 4. But I like to start the course with Daisy Miller because it addresses a lot of issues that we'll be returning to again and again throughout the semester. So even though we'll be starting with this work that was published in the later 1800s, we'll go back to the mid 1800s or so for the next few weeks after that. Daisy Miller is not a hard read. We are reading it over 2 weeks, just simply because it's a novella and I want to spend 2 weeks on it, but not because it's a particularly difficult read. All of the works in the anthology have introductory notes to them. Sometimes those are helpful. In the case of Daisy Miller, I don't see anything particularly helpful there. It's more about Henry James and his progression as a writer, because there are other pieces by James in the anthology. If you want to read that, fine. Usually I encourage you to read the notes, but this time I really don't see where it's going to help you all that much. So that's entirely up to you. Some of the things that I think will help you understand Daisy Miller is the time period in America is one after the Civil War. We're moving towards the 1900s, the early 20th century, and we are starting to see a class of Americans that are becoming very wealthy, mostly off of railroads and manufacturing. You're familiar probably with the Biltmore family. Some of you have probably been to the Biltmore estate in Asheville. So you've seen the kind of wealth that can come with that. I'll provide a couple of clips for you, little video clips to look at to see some of those houses and see some of the clothing these people wore, some images. Um, so we had our kind of own American royalty here in the United States. What you're seeing in Daisy Miller is a story set in Europe, in Geneva and Switzerland, and then in Rome, um, where there are perceptions of Americans as being upstarts, that Americans who are wealthy and have money yet do not possess that ancient lineage that the aristocracy in Europe has. So the characters in the story, including the Americans who are called expatriates, they've moved to Europe and live there. They're sort of in a kind of strange nowhere land, sort of, they're not absolutely accepted by the European aristocracy, in whose circles they sort of travel. And they also reject, as the aristocracy rejects, these wealthy Americans who are coming to Europe. They're taking tours. It's a relatively safe period of time in American history. Um, they're coming to Europe to travel and see all the pictures that they've seen in art books and heard about in museums and so on. They do not possess the culture and polish of the Europeans. At least that's how the Europeans see it. So there's this clash between um, the new money of the Americans. They have plenty of money, and they're happy to tell you how much money they have. Um, Much of the European aristocracy does not necessarily have a lot of money anymore, but they have that title, that history, that tradition. So that's that clash between new money and old money. And the character of Winterbourne, he's not our narrator, but the story is told mostly through his point of view, a very limited point of view. So um, we see Daisy mostly through his eyes. Um, so we have the story from this American who doesn't really fit in either group, but who rejects, not as vigorously, this young, flirtatious American girl who is uncultured, um, but is attracted to her at the same time. Um, so you're going to read the first two, I call them chapters, they're not really chapters, the first two parts of Daisy Miller. So that'll take you from 327 to 345. That's our first two sections. And this takes us up to a break between the meeting of Daisy and Winterbourne. They sort of part ways for a while, and then they'll come back together again in Rome later. So let's see, steamships, railroad, kind of looking over my notes here. Among many things that we're going to talk about throughout this semester is the idea of being American. This is a time period when American literature is finally coming into its own. It's receiving a little recognition. The same cannot be said necessarily for art. That happens a little later. But in terms of literature, we're starting to make some inroads in America. And you know, we don't have our own Shakespeare yet. But we have writers like James who are creating a real American literature. James is an expatriate just like Winterbourne. He eventually moves to Europe and stays there for most of his adult life. So he has a way of looking at both the Europeans and the Americans. He has a particular vantage point. So he is able to sort of delineate pretty clearly what these clashing points of view are. So that's something we're going to talk about again and again. What does it mean to be an American? How are we perceived by other people? How does our literature demonstrate who we are? So as you read through these first couple of sections, sort of pay attention to this clash between the old world and the new world. It's not the most exciting book, right? This is James was really most interested in, as were other writers of this time, this was a time of psychological realism, interested in the workings, the inner workings of humans and how they developed and their motives for doing things. So as you go through, look, as I've already mentioned, the clash between the European views, kind of spoken by Winterbourne, and the American views, kind of portrayed by Daisy. And then also look at how Miller is portraying both Winterbourne and Daisy psychologically. What are they like as people? And I find Daisy particularly difficult to get a handle on. I'm not always sure why she acts the way she does. Is she as innocent as she appears? Which is some of the same questions that Winterbourne has. So I hope that's enough to get you started. You'll have an activity this week to go along with Daisy Miller, and then a longer activity at the end of next week. So ask if you have any questions. But you know, just get started on that and see what you make of Daisy for yourself.